Part 5. Rust Belt Blues. Chapter 35. Latonia City, Pennsylvania, July 1939. The Monday after Gideon Russ played the derrick, clouds hung dark above Latonia City, bloated with the promise of rain. Rain that Seneca County badly needed. Perhaps, thought Nat as he stared up at the smiling stone face on the side of the Derrick Theater, today would finally mark the end of the long drought of the summer of '39 and help to refill the wells. Nat returned the stone face's smile, thinking back to Saturday night. Where there's a will, there's always a way, he reminded himself. He would never forget it. Dick wasn't with him today. Instead, his only company was the cornet in his hand and the 3 nickels in his pocket. Part of him worried about the thought of being caught out in the rain with his prized instrument, but it was Monday afternoon and everything was open. Plenty of doorways to duck into, and plenty of stores and service stations and what have you for a boy to waste a bit of time in while he waited for the rain to pass. But maybe if he hurried, he could still make it across the bridge and over to Hart Sounds before the skies let loose. He heard a distant rumble of thunder and for some reason found his eyes drawn away from the smiling face toward the one on the other side of the building. The frowning, disproportionately stretched, almost horrified-looking face that represented tragedy. Nat's smile faltered a bit. No matter how old he got, he'd never get over the look of that one. It was like something out of a nightmare. He reached into his pocket and closed his hand around the 3 nickels, counting them with his thumb to make sure they were all still there. Then he turned and ran down the sidewalk toward the bridge. Most 10-year-olds lucky enough to have found themselves with a bit of spending money on a summer's day would have been intent on taking in a picture at one of the town's theaters or blowing it all on sweets at the drugstore. But Nat McCulloch had more important things to attend to. After all, he'd put to writing what he intended to do. He had placed it inside the basement wall and committed it to the Lord and to time, just as his father had told him to. And now he'd witnessed his future firsthand, had seen it on stage before his very eyes, live and in person. If he wanted it, it was up to him now. From here on out, he vowed every free moment would be spent pursuing it, until he was the one up on that theater stage, performing while his da watched him from the front row. Nat hadn't quite made it across the bridge that spanned Rockwell Creek when the rain began. Heavy fat drops that bespoke the prelude to a downpour. A train whistle sounded, and he was grateful that there was no chance of getting stuck at the crossing behind the street traffic. The rain was picking up as he passed the Latonia National Bank building, where employees were hurrying to pull the doors shut on the ground floor and close the windows up on the second story, where the prices were wired from New York City. That rumored faraway place to which his grandfather had driven locomotives, back before whatever had gone wrong in the old man. Thunder growled more loudly overhead, and Nat considered taking refuge inside the Seneca Transit Center or the department store across the street. But Hart Sounds wasn't much further, so he tucked his cornet under his shirt and kept going. A block past the transit center, he crossed the street, feeling rainwater soaking through his shoes and into his socks. A moment after he crossed, an ambulance car with its lights flashing drove past behind him, and as he grabbed the handle to the door of Hart Sound, he caught a glimpse of it coming to a stop in front of the lowered gate of the railroad crossing. The driver of the ambulance leaned out to argue with the signalman, but it was too late. The locomotive was coming through. Nat threw open the door and rushed in, greeted by the sound of a record. He didn't recognize the tune, but he'd have bet 2 of his 3 nickels that it was Glenn Miller. Gid Rust had come and gone, it seemed, and so had the citywide mania for his music. Latonia City was moving on to other things. There were only a few patrons in the store this afternoon, and all of them stopped and stared at this sopping wet youth just a few days past 10 years old, standing in the doorway with a distinctly trumpet-shaped bulge under his dripping shirt, looking the part of a comically inept shoplifter. At the front of the store, young Art Hart manned the register. "Hey, Art," Nat called as he always did, hurrying to the front of the store. Art, in a betrayal of his usual serious nature, was smiling from ear to ear at the sight of Nat, and Nat smiled right back at him. So far, Nat hadn't bothered trying to tell anybody about what they'd done on Saturday night. For one thing, he didn't think anyone would believe him. And for another, he knew that, were he to try to put his story to words, something was bound to be lost in translation and ruin its near perfection. It would have been like trying to relate to someone a half-remembered dream, and he'd have hated to see that glazed-over look come into someone's eyes, the look adults got when they switched from listening to you to waiting for you to finish. The best things in life were always better left unexplained anyway, and always to just be good, without trying to convince anyone of their goodness. Something about the look in Art's face told Nat that he hadn't told anybody about their caper either. For now, their secret mission was still a secret. "Poppy says you can't hang around unless you help out," Art reminded him by way of greeting. Nat pulled his cornet out from under his damp shirt and placed it on the counter. Then, much less delicately, he pulled the 3 nickels from his pocket and slapped them down. "Who's hanging around?" demanded Nat. "I'm here to do business, my good man." "Oh, yeah?" said Art. Somewhere in the back of the store, a phone rang, and Nat heard Poppy Hart answer, proof that Art wasn't minding the store on his own. Nevertheless, Art leaned forward and propped one elbow on the counter in his best imitation of a big-shot salesman. The effect might have been more compelling had he been tall enough to comfortably reach the counter. "What'll it be, Mac?" Art asked. "Ran out of valve oil," said Nat. "I can't solo like Ged with my valve sticking." "Maybe if you didn't carry it around inside a wet shirt," offered Art. Nat tapped a finger meaningfully against one of the 3 nickels on the countertop. "If I want advice, I'll ask for it, young feller. Oil, toot sweet." "You're the boss," Art said. He adjusted his apron before heading to the wall behind the counter where such things were stored. It was during the interim between one Glenn Miller track and the next that the door to Hart's Sound swung violently open, and Dick came skidding in like a bird dog on a frozen pond. Behind him, the rain was coming down in sheets on the street. The sidewalks were deserted. Even those with umbrellas had decided to wait this one out. All except Dick. "I just cleaned those floors, you know," Art said from behind the counter. Nat had begun to laugh at the state of Dick, and was trying to think of a comparison that would be poetic. What he really looked like was Sam McClintock after 3 dunks in the lake, but the present company wasn't likely to understand or appreciate this parallel. Nat stopped laughing, however, when he saw the look on Dick's face. His cheeks were sickly white, and his eyes were bulging and red. When Dick saw Nat, his face went even whiter, if that was possible. "Oh, Lord," said Dick. "Nat. Oh, God, Nat." Nat and Art exchanged worried looks. It was all over Dick's face. Someone must have found out what they'd done. Had one of the ushers recognized them? Or had the police simply figured out where the flour sack and pilfered rope grappling hook had come from? What sort of trouble could you get in for breaking in to see a show? What would his parents say? All these thoughts and others had time to pass through Nat's head before Dick finally managed to open his mouth. But whatever Dick was about to say was cut off by Poppy Hart emerging from the back room. Poppy's piercing blue eyes noticed Dick first, then Nat, and his face fell. "You're here," he said to Nat. Nat wasn't sure if it was supposed to be a question or not, but something about the way Poppy said it made Nat sick to his stomach. Poppy stepped out from behind the counter. He had the same wispy yellow hair as his son and might have been just as thin once, but now carried a spare tire around his middle. Nat barely knew the man, which made it all the more bizarre when Poppy placed one soft, thin-fingered hand on his shoulder. Even his father didn't show this sort of affection. The MacCullochs were, after all, not huggers. "Son," said Poppy, "I just got off the phone with... There has been an accident at Germania." Nat found himself thinking of the ambulance car that had driven by just as he'd crossed the street, the one that had gotten stopped at the railroad crossing. "Okay," was all Nat could think to say. It came out as raspy and gravelly as Gid Rust's vocals. Poppy Hart's soft, thin fingers squeezed Nat's shoulder. "Nat, they're saying your father fell." Chapter 36. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, November 1982. As far as Lou McCulloch was concerned, drinking like a fish and laying a guy out in a drunken brawl didn't make you tough. What made you tough was how you carried yourself the day after. And the day after that night, in 1982, just happened to be Thanksgiving Day. He woke up in someone else's bed, alone, in a dorm room in a part of campus he'd never been to before. He didn't know how he'd gotten there. Perhaps some kind soul had lent him a bed to prevent him from having to travel all the way back to the towers. He left in the early morning hours and walked home to his dorm. By the time most people were having breakfast, Lou was showered, shaved, and ready for the day. But the day would bring nothing, because he planned to go nowhere and see no one. As far as Lou could tell, he was the only one on the entire floor. The pay phone in the dorm had rang every hour, practically on the hour, all day Thursday. He suspected that it was his mother trying to reach him, but Lou never found out because he didn't bother to pick up the ringing phone. His aversion to seeing or speaking with his father had grown temporarily stronger than his instinct not to upset his mother, and that was saying something. It wasn't until Friday night, after the phone call stopped, that Lou considered the possibility that it hadn't been his mom trying to call him at all. He had made Angie Schultz a promise. Now he desperately wished he'd picked up the phone when he'd had the chance. If her name showed up in the Oildham News-Herald police blotter on Monday morning, he knew he would never forgive himself. Lou didn't go home on Thanksgiving or the next day, or the day after that, or the day after that either. He managed to find a party every night that weekend except for Sunday. Thursday night, Friday night, and Saturday night, he got just as blind drunk as he'd gotten the night he'd driven back to campus. By Sunday, students were trickling back in, their Thanksgiving break over. Having failed to locate a party that night, Lou had to settle for a small get-together in a shady basement, but that didn't slow him down. If anything, that night was the most debauched of all. Nevertheless, he still made it to his first class the following morning, showered, shaved, and with his hair looking perfect. And 15 minutes early. If you weren't 15 minutes early, you were late. He went to each of his classes with nothing to visibly set him apart from any other typical day, other than his lip, which was still a bit swollen from somebody busting his chops a few nights prior. There was no business degree in his future. Next semester, he would have a fresh start, taking art classes on the side of the campus where classrooms looked like studios or warehouses. The credits he was earning this semester, on the side of campus where classrooms looked like classrooms, would mean nothing in the long run. But Lou McCulloch didn't start anything without finishing it, so he would damn well finish his semester of business courses. After all, he had to keep his grades up to stay on the ball team. Might as well ace his finals while he was at it, just to prove he could. It wasn't until his final class on that Monday afternoon, for some reason in the middle of jotting a note about amortization, that Lou started to feel bad about what he'd said to his father. Initially, the feeling attempted to disguise itself as self-interest. He needed to stay in school to keep playing baseball. He didn't agree with his parents about a lot of things, but yelling at them had been a stupid thing to do. He knew now that he probably shouldn't have tried to hide his change of major either. If his father refused to pay for him to continue going to school, maybe he could borrow enough money to keep himself afloat for another year. Besides, he'd heard about an upcoming open tryout for one of Baltimore's farm teams. If he kept playing the way he had last year, he wouldn't need school to play ball. But as class wore on, the veneer of self-interest wore thin. "I was told to stay away from the MacCulloch family because they were bad news," echoed the words of Deb McClintock, whose uncle, it was told, had been on the receiving end of a whooping courtesy of Grant McCulloch just a few days before Grant's death. "Even my dad knows that a bad word said against Nat McCulloch's character is a lie." "All I ask," echoed the words of his mother, "is that you don't put your father under any more stress than he already is. Please." "Louis McCulloch," said a deep voice. The entire class looked up from their notes. The only one who seemed more surprised by the interruption than Lou was Dr. Brunner, at the front of the room, who had paused midway through writing something on the blackboard and was now looking curiously at the doorway. A tall man with a full dark black beard had ducked his head into the classroom. He had one hand resting on the doorframe. The other he raised and used to gesture apologetically toward the professor. Lou recognized him as Dr. Emmett Steinberg, Dean of the College of Business Administration. "Sorry, Dr. Brunner," said Dr. Steinberg. "Is there a Louis McCulloch in here?" Every pair of eyes in the auditorium-style classroom turned toward Lou. Lou raised his hand. "Here," he said loudly. Dr. Steinberg frowned, then sighed. "Mr. McCulloch, would you come with me, please?" Lou looked around. "I'm in class right now," he said. Lou wouldn't have imagined that Dr. Steinberg's frown could have moved any lower on his face than it already was. But it did. "Come with me," Dr. Steinberg said. "Now, please." Lou exhaled sharply, a sound halfway between a scoff and an incredulous laugh. Now it was a new voice that was echoing in his head. "I did not work and save my entire life so that my boy could learn to paint." The old man certainly hadn't wasted any time. The 100 or so eyes continued to watch Lou as he slammed his notebook shut and gathered up his things. "I can't believe this," he said without caring who heard. Dr. Brunner, who had paused dramatically with his chalk still touching the board in mid-stroke, waited silently. At the doorway, Dr. Steinberg stepped back to allow Lou to walk past him. Then Dr. Steinberg said, "Follow me," and began to walk down the hallway. A moment later, Lou heard Dr. Brunner clear his throat just as dramatically and continue his lecture. It was the sound of Lou's education moving on without him, as if he'd never been there at all. A few steps later, still following the tall, quiet Dr. Steinberg, Lou began to second-guess his first assumption. Blame it on the brain fog left over from an eventful weekend. Even if Nat had been upset enough with him to have decided to cut off all financial support, was that the sort of thing the dean would pull you out of class for? No, of course it wasn't. Lou's classes for this semester were paid for. Now that he really thought about it, getting pulled out of a college classroom was the kind of thing that only happened if you were in some sort of trouble. And suddenly, following Dr. Steinberg down that tile-floored hallway felt like a very long walk. "I think there's an open room up here where we can talk," said Dr. Steinberg. Lou thought back to his impulsive trip down here on Wednesday night, driving like a bat out of hell and feeling a bit like one too. He thought back to getting terrifically, colossally sauced that evening, woo-woo, and the room spinning around him. He thought about the mystery bed he'd woken up in the next morning, in a part of campus he'd never been to before. But mostly he thought about his split lip and the fellow he'd laid out with one punch. Until now, he hadn't worried much about who'd been on the receiving end of that slug, or what had happened to him afterward. He tried to remember the details and realized he didn't recall seeing the guy get up. "Okay, right in here," said Dr. Steinberg and gestured toward an open doorway. It was a classroom nearly identical to the one where Dr. Brunner was currently continuing his lecture, now with one open seat. The room was the size of a small auditorium, with stadium-style seating that went up and back some 50 rows deep. Behind Lou, Dr. Steinberg pulled the door shut. The sound of it closing echoed through the auditorium, and Lou felt a bit like he'd just stepped into the batter's box in the top of the ninth with 2 outs, down by too many runs to stand a hope, no chance left to be a hero, only a chance to keep yourself alive long enough not to be the last guy to go down. "Take a seat," said Dr. Steinberg. "Do I have to?" said Lou flatly. Dr. Steinberg's frown deepened yet again. "I think you should." Lou wasn't normally one to back down, but he also wasn't one to be obstinate just for the sake of it. He selected a chair in the front row. Dr. Steinberg leaned back against the podium from which professors in the Department of Business Administration lectured about topics like credit interest, intangible assets, and other things that Lou couldn't wait to never hear about again. Then Dr. Steinberg put a hand over his mouth and let out a long sigh that escaped through his fingers like air brakes on a big rig. "Louis," said Dr. Steinberg. "Lou," Lou corrected. "Sorry," said Dr. Steinberg. Lou, I don't feel right about being the one to tell you this, but I don't know who the right person would be, given the circumstances, and it wouldn't be fair to keep you in the dark until that person were to show up. We just received a call at the main office. I contacted your academic advisor, who informed me of your schedule, and I came right over personally as quickly as I could. Lou, your father had a heart attack this morning. He was on the golf course alone. By the time somebody found him, it was too late. Lou felt numb. Too late? He said. I'm sorry, son, said Dr. Steinberg. Your dad is dead. Chapter 37. Latonia City, Pennsylvania, December 2019. There are times when the exact wording of a piece of terrible news is etched in one's heart forever, as immutable and ugly as a block-lettered name scored in the bark of an old tree, and the mind requires no great leap to return to the instant when the news was given, bringing into sharp detail the sights, smells, and thoughts of that never-forgotten moment. But for Owen, all he would remember was that the news came in the form of a frantic phone call from Kayla when he'd been climbing into the car, about to leave his parents' house, just a few minutes after reading a note his grandfather had written on a playbill as a boy. Owen didn't remember much of this drive from Silvern Row either. One moment he was answering the call. The next he was pulling into Ruth Lee's driveway. No, his driveway, to find a fire truck in the front yard and a small fleet of volunteer firefighter vehicles with blue lights spinning atop their roofs and on their dashboards. Kayla had told him over the phone that everyone had made it out. He would believe it when he saw it. It struck him how many people were there. A small crowd, most of whom appeared to be just standing and watching. He saw no flames, no billowing clouds of smoke as he might have expected. Surely that was a good sign. But everywhere hung a brown-yellow haze, turning the view of the house and the front yard into a sepia-toned photo. The odor was deep in his nostrils before he even threw the Ford Focus into park. It was not the sort of burning smell with which he was familiar. Not like a fireplace. More like a burn barrel. But dirtier. More chemical. He reached to unbuckle his seatbelt, realized he hadn't buckled it, and fumbled with the door handle several times before he managed to get it open. Kayla saw him before he saw her. Emma was in her arms, and she came running to him out of the crowd. His girls. His beautiful, wonderful girls. Owen threw his arms around them, gripped a fistful of the back of Kayla's shirt, pulled Emma's head against his chest and buried his face in her dark, curly hair. I love you, he said as tears spilled from his eyes into their hair. God, I love you. Thank you, Jesus. Owen, Kayla cried into his shoulder. Where's your mom? He said. She's fine, said Kayla. She's here. Oh, God, Owen. He could taste the brownish, chemical-smelling haze in the air and felt an involuntary spasm at the back of his throat. He swallowed against it. We're okay, he said, speaking as much to himself as to anyone else. We're all okay. That's all that matters. Dada, said Emma. Emma, said Owen, kissing her on the head. Emma, my sweet girl. He turned to Kayla. What happened? We don't know yet, she said, wiping her face. Mom and Emma and I went to the store. When we came back, the smoke alarms were going off, and we could smell something burning. Mom was determined to go in and get the dogs. She opened the door, and when they didn't come out, she was going to try to crawl in under the smoke. I practically had to drag her away from the door. The fumes were so bad that just being close made me dizzy. I don't know how bad it is. Scanning the crowd, Owen saw Ruth Lee talking to a firefighter. A hose ran from the largest truck across the yard, past Owen's old rusty bike leaned against the siding, and in through the front door. As Owen watched, a firefighter in full gear stepped out through the hazy doorway. Balanced in his outstretched arms was a blackened ball of fur. Kayla turned Emma away. The firefighter made his way to the front lawn, where he kneeled and laid the body of Wilma, the beagle of indeterminate age, out in the grass. Ruth Lee went to Wilma, got down on her knees, and began to pet her. Then Ruth Lee, whom Owen had never seen shed a tear in his life, put her head in her hands, and her shoulders shook with sobs. Bandit? Asked Kayla, still looking away. Owen shook his head. Wilma. We shouldn't have left, Kayla said. If we'd been home, maybe we could have stopped it. If you'd been home, thought Owen. Oh, God, if you'd been home. He couldn't finish the thought. He pulled his girls close again, and this time it was Kayla's hair that he buried his face in. His hands trembled. "I don't know what to do," Kayla said. "Neither do I," thought Owen. Letting go of Kayla with one hand, he took out his phone and tried to call his dad first. It rang half a dozen times and went to voicemail. "Hey!" someone shouted. Hey, look what we've got here!" Owen turned toward the voice. One of the firefighters had opened the door to the attached garage, and out jumped a teddy bear-looking puppy that came tearing across the yard. "Here, boy!" Owen shouted, dropping down on his knees. "Bandit! Here, boy!" Bandit leapt into Owen's arms. Kayla nuzzled his face. Emma laughed, and Bandit tasted tears as his chicken nugget nub of a tail wiggled back and forth. Owen decided to try calling his mom next, but before he could call, a new text message appeared on his screen. "Don't want to worry you," read the text from his mother, "but I can't get a hold of your dad, and his phone's GPS is in the same place it was when I checked 45 minutes ago. You know the golf course better than I do. Is there a reason he would stay in that spot?" Owen's chest went cold. Chapter 38. The MacCulloch Curse. Owen had never believed in such things, and he didn't think his father ever had either. But as he took the turn at the top of the hill and slammed the gas pedal to the floor of the Ford Focus, he couldn't help but wonder if curses, when they came to collect, didn't care whether you believed in them or not. Scoreboards didn't lie. Callum McCulloch, a locomotive driver who'd been relieved of his job after he'd started hearing voices and had taken his own life by stepping in front of a moving train. He had been 38 years old. Grant McCulloch, a factory worker who'd been killed in an accident at the Germania Oil Well Supply Company. He'd fallen from a catwalk and had died in the back of an ambulance car while it was halted at a railroad crossing. He had just turned 40. Nat McCulloch, an accountant turned Chamber of Commerce director who died of a heart attack attributed to hypertension aggravated by stress while alone on a golf course, just a few days after resigning from his position amid controversy. There had been multiple threats on his life in the weeks leading up to that day, resulting in rumors. Never investigated and thus never substantiated, but also never disproven, of foul play being involved. At 53 years old, he'd been the longest-lived McCulloch male in generations. Lou McCulloch, a high school art teacher who, at the current age of 57, had lived the longest of any of them, so far. And Louis Owen McCulloch, who had gone by his middle name Owen all his life to avoid confusion, a 32-year-old copy editor at the Oildham Morning Herald, currently racing toward the golf course where the GPS location of his father's phone last placed him. After receiving his mother's text message, Owen had realized that he had a few options. Call someone and ask them to go looking for his father, or drive to the golf course and look for himself. "I don't want you to go alone," Kayla said. "I'll come with you. Do you want me to drive?" She is an angel, Owen thought. "Right now, I think your mom needs you," Owen said. "I can do this myself." But then he hesitated. "We are fine," Kayla said, sensing his apprehension at the idea of leaving them. "But your dad might need you." Owen pulled off the main road and onto the narrow state road that led to a little country golf course, the one whose owners allowed their regular customers to walk on whenever they liked during the cold winter months, as long as they didn't mind golfing without flags on the greens, and as long as it meant the occasional 20 slipped under the door of the clubhouse. The course Lou frequented, despite the fact that frankly he wasn't all that good at golf, and the same golf course where his father Nat had been found dead 37 years prior. Owen had called his mother shortly after leaving Ruth Lee's house to tell her about the fire. Now, Deb was heading over there to be with Ruth Lee, Kayla, and Emma. As for her husband's missing in action status on the golf course, Deb seemed to think he must have just dropped his phone somewhere. It didn't seem to have occurred to her that any other explanation could account for his stagnant GPS location. She'd even tried to convince Owen not to drive out to find him. "You can't leave your house right now," Deb had protested. "Your dad will show up any minute." "I'm sure you're right, Mom," Owen had said, though he wasn't. "But it will make me feel better to check." The entrance to the golf course was a dirt lane off the state road, but Owen bypassed it. A little further along, this road intersected the course between holes 4 and 5, and he knew it would be faster for him to park beside the cart crossing and walk to hole 6 from there. The shock of the house fire had nearly worn off by now, replaced by memories of being in the room at the hospital the day they told his father about his high blood sugar. Owen thought about how Lou had shrugged it off as one more little plastic bottle with his name on it. He thought about their fight months ago on the very same golf course, and he thought about how his father never drove a cart when he played 18 holes. Instead, he always walked the course despite the way he'd been huffing and puffing the last time they'd gone out together. Owen pulled off to the side of the road beside a yellow sign with a black outline of a golf cart on it, shifted the focus into park, and removed the keys. He opened the door. For a moment, he almost couldn't bring himself to step out of the car. It was so quiet out here. The sunny 35-degree day was now overcast, and the temperature had dropped maybe as low as 30 or 25. In an hour, the sun would be down. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart and prepare himself for what he was about to find. Then he stepped out of the car. He didn't run. He walked quickly. It was the kind of walk he'd often utilized on this same course in the past to keep up with his father, who always got impatient if you didn't hustle. His philosophy was that anything that was worth doing was also worth hustling for. Owen hadn't always felt like hustling. Golf was supposed to be fun and relaxing, after all. But he was hustling now. He hurried over the wide, dipping fairway of hole 5. He shielded his face against the winter-bare gnarls of bushes as he veered off the fairway and cut the corner of number 5's sharp dogleg left. This brought him out on the other side, back onto the fairway with some scrapes on his forearms. Behind the green was a copse of trees with a path leading into a more thickly wooded area, where the final hole of the front 9 meandered their way back to the clubhouse. By the time Owen made it to the back of the green and reached the trees, he couldn't stand to merely hustle anymore. He took off running down the wooded path toward hole 6. "Looks like he's on the 6th green right now," his mother had said. He sprinted down the hole 6 fairway. It was a narrow one. A hook or a slice would have put you into the trees on either side. And there was a water hazard, too small to be called a pond, more like a very wide ditch. At the moment, it was frozen over. He could see the green now, and there was something lying on the ground. It was just beyond the green. Difficult to tell what it was from here, and it looked like a piece of blue fabric sticking out from behind a large oak at the center of the cart path. Owen's throat was dry and his lungs were already burning, but he ran even faster. So fast that he tripped and nearly toppled forward, but managed to regain his footing. "Please, God," Owen prayed. Perhaps ideally he ought to have been uttering a more specific invocation. But his mind was too jumbled, his wits too shaken after having had his life turned upside down at least once, and now perhaps twice in the past hour, to think of any other words to say as he ran. "Please, God. Please, God." By the time he reached the green, he had shifted to repeating it aloud. "Please, God. Please, God." He bypassed the green and hurried to the cart path. There, his feet faltered. The piece of fabric on the ground appeared to be a shirt sleeve. He didn't want to take another step. It was that old denial thing again, the naivete of his consciousness that seemed convinced that if he turned around now, nothing bad would have happened. Like a bad dream, maybe he could just wake up from it if he tried really hard. He stepped forward, and he blinked in confusion. The shirt sleeve he could see now was not connected to a shirt, because it wasn't a shirt sleeve at all. It was a small blue towel with a metal clip on it like a key ring, the kind that golfers attach to their bags to wipe clean the heads of their clubs, and it was clear, judging by the dirt and bits of leaves stuck in its fibers, that it had been there a long time. Beside it, with feet curled and neck twisted back strangely, lay a dead body of a small bird, a common American robin. Owen looked around. Based on the GPS location, this was where he'd expected to find something. But he saw nothing other than somebody's old lost rag. He'd nearly resolved to take off in a sprint to hole 7 and repeat the whole affair when an idea occurred to him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and called his father's number. A buzzing sound, the vibrating of a phone, coming from nearby. He turned in place, trying to pinpoint the source. It wasn't coming from ahead, toward hole 7. And it wasn't coming from the woods either. It was coming from behind him, on the green he had bypassed. Backtracking, he followed the buzzing to the back edge of the green. There, in the inch-and-a-half tall grass, where the fringe ended and the rough began, laying face down, was Lou McCulloch's cell phone. Owen picked it up. For some reason, he thought it prudent to swipe his finger across the screen to choose to ignore his own incoming call. In doing so, he saw that his missed call was one of many. "There's that damn thing." Owen wheeled toward the voice. Down beside the cart path, Lou stood looking up at his son with his hands on his hips in annoyance. He wore a heavy winter coat, jeans, dark aviator sunglasses, and a Nike hat. And there was a crooked smile on his face. A fancy seeing you here sort of look. "Must have fallen out of my bag," said Lou. "I've been retracing my steps for half an hour at least. Didn't expect to find you with it, though." Owen started walking toward his dad, gradually becoming aware of the rapid pace of his heartbeat and how hard he was panting from his run. As he got closer, Lou's fancy seeing you here expression melted away, and he took off his sunglasses. "What's wrong?" he asked. Owen kept walking. He stopped in front of Lou. "You're all right?" Owen asked. Lou looked himself over. "Of course I'm all right," he said. The McCullochs were not huggers, but Owen stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father. "I'm sorry, Dad." Lou stood frozen in place for a moment. He returned the embrace cautiously, adding a polite pat on Owen's shoulder. "I'm sorry, too. What's going on?" "There was a fire at our house," said Owen. Lou pulled away. "The girls?" he said. "They're fine," said Owen. "Everyone's safe. Except poor Wilma. But our house—" It was just like Lou McCulloch to say nothing in response. But for once, Owen didn't take the bait. And after a few moments, Lou grabbed Owen and pulled him into a second hug. There was something different about this one, though. He'd returned Owen's initial embrace in an obligatory way. Now his arms wrapped all the way around, and his hands grabbed tightly to Owen's shoulders. "You're all right," he said into Owen's ear. "And your girls are all right. Nothing else matters." "But our house," Owen repeated. "Forget the house," said Lou. "You will get through this. We will get through this. Do you understand me? We will get through this." Chapter 39. Owen didn't sleep that night, as he'd known he wouldn't. On a normal evening, he'd have been at work at the paper. Instead, he spent the first part of the night being led through the house by firefighters with flashlights. The house had been saved, but the consensus was that it would be a long time before it was livable again. It appeared that an electrical fire had started in the basement, not all that uncommon in houses with old wiring. The firefighters told Owen there hadn't been many flames really, but the melting wires had caused the home to quickly fill with invisible, odorless carbon monoxide. If it had happened in the middle of the night, while everyone had been home, Owen's family might never have woken up. Inside, a sticky layer of residue, soot the firefighters had called it, but it was more like tar, covered everything. One of the firefighters showed Owen how, when he moved one of Emma's pink sippy cups that had been left on the kitchen counter, the place where it had been sitting was completely unaffected, leaving a negative image of the cup's location in the soot. Then the same firefighter used his flashlight to point out where Wilma had been lying on the kitchen floor. Her body had left a cookie-cutter perfect beagle outline in the soot, a reverse snow angel complete with a comma-shaped tail where the linoleum floor was still clean and white. The rest of the floor was black. Ruth Lee took some comfort in the fact that Wilma hadn't been burned. It had been the fumes. For the old, mostly beagle, it would have been like drifting off to sleep. Through everything, Owen's father was there with him, not hovering over his shoulder, not taking charge, most of the time not even saying a word, just there. Finally, around the same time that Owen would have normally been getting off work at the paper, Lou drove him to the house on Sylvan Row. The house his father had grown up in, and that his grandfather had grown up in before him. That sort of thing didn't happen much nowadays. It was kind of neat when Owen thought about it. His first priority was to check on his girls. Deb had set them up in the master bedroom. There he found 3 generations of women in the same bed, sleeping the hard, deep sleep of exhaustion. A sleeping bag and pillow were prepared for Owen on the floor. He lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling and listening to Ruth Lee, Kayla, and Emma breathing, and thinking how grateful he was for those sounds. When it became clear that sleep wasn't going to come, he got up and went out to the kitchen. It was 4:03 a.m., and Lou was standing with his arms crossed, leaning with his rear end against the counter. Owen took up a similar position nearby. Lou had already put on a pot of coffee. When the coffee maker grumbled, then groaned, then hissed, Lou poured them each a cup. Bandit, the corgi puppy, wandered in and sat, looking at them expectantly at first. But when it became clear that the humans were not going to do anything interesting, he lay down, sighed heavily, and went to sleep. For a long time, Owen and Lou remained silent, staring into their respective cups, as if by looking hard enough they might find their answers somewhere within those molecules of water filtered through beans from a faraway place. After a while, the kitchen windows began to lighten, and that was how the night of the fire became the morning after it. It was how time would be measured from then on. Just as the Christian calendar measured time in reference to the lifespan of a noteworthy carpenter, so would the McCullochs measure everything from then on in reference to a singular event. Anno Ignis. Owen got another cup of coffee. "What's going through your head?" asked Lou. For a man who wasn't much of a talker, he didn't beat around the bush when he got the notion to say something. "That I've got to get my family out of this town," said Owen, "before anything else happens." "If you're talking about what I think you're talking about," said Lou, "it's a bunch of bull and you know it." "That's what I've always thought," said Owen. "But look at what happened to your dad, and his dad, and his dad, and now this. How was that not a curse?" Lou didn't even have to think about the answer. "Because you didn't lose anyone in it." He let those words hang in the kitchen air, alongside the motes of dust caught in the first sunbeams streaming through the window. "That girl you said you work with at the Herald," said Lou. "Felicia? Did I tell you I knew her mother?" "No," said Owen. Lou nodded. "Once, when I was driving home from Pitt, I found her walking along the side of 322, alone in the cold and the rain, no coat. 15 years old. I picked her up and gave her a ride. She was beaten up pretty badly. Turned out, she was in the car with her father and they got into an argument, and he threw her out of the vehicle and just drove off. Left her there, bleeding on the side of the road, and kept driving. I found out a couple of days after that her dad wrecked his car later that same night. He was drunk, going too fast, and took his Chevy off the road and straight into a telephone pole. The guy didn't get a scratch. Drunkards have the devil's luck, as your grandmother once told me, but the whole passenger side of his car was nearly sheared off by the impact, right where that girl would have been sitting if she hadn't been walking along 322 with no coat and a black eye." Owen was only partially listening. Instead, he found himself thinking again of the place on the kitchen floor where Wilma had been lying, the white, dog-shaped form surrounded by black, a shape as clear as a coloring book picture. He thought about what the firefighters had told him, how high concentrations of carbon monoxide could kill so quickly that the poor dog may never have even known she was in danger. How a human being asleep at the time of exposure can easily continue sleeping through the initial symptoms and die without ever waking up. How people in their beds could slip away, never even realizing anything was wrong. And he thought about his daughter's crib in the bedroom upstairs, and what sort of morning this would have been if the fire had occurred a few hours later, while he'd been at work and his wife and child and mother-in-law had been asleep. Owen's father went to the corner of the kitchen. There, the old playbill that the contractors had exhumed from the wall of the basement during their repairs sat on the countertop. He placed his palm on it, resting his fingers beside his long-dead father's handwritten note. The words of a 10-year-old boy making promises about a grand future. "Obviously, your grandfather did not become a world-famous trumpet player," said Lou. He gave a quiet chuckle. "To tell you the truth, I never thought he was very good, and I never played baseball at the pro level the way I wanted to. Hell, most people don't achieve the dreams they have when they're kids, but I don't think it means we're failures. It just means that dreams change. And the dreams that don't change, well, they take longer than you expect them to. longer than some of us are given on this earth. Nat McCulloch was no Gid Rust, but look at what he did instead. The businesses he helped during the hard times, the hospital, this house, the legacy he left for me. Look at this family. I've got a wife and a son, a wonderful daughter-in-law, a beautiful granddaughter, all sleeping safely under my roof even after what happened. He shook his head. Son, no man with so many blessings could be cursed. Lou paused to sip his coffee, then continued. Your grandfather was a good man, but he lived believing, and I think he was convinced at some level, that he would either die young like his dad or live long enough to lose his mind like people said his grandfather did. That was the story he told himself. He was a troubled person, but he never backed down from doing what he thought was right, even when a very vocal minority of this community wanted to tar and feather him and run him out of town. There were rumors about some sort of foul play surrounding his death. But that's just a bunch of small-town gossip. For a long time, I was convinced that it was the stress I put him through that finally proved too much for him. But the truth is, he was likely living with undiagnosed heart disease and, possibly like me, diabetes. And, in spite of it, he still outlived his father by 15 or 20 years. Grading on a curve, I'd say he did all right. All my generation wanted to do was get out from under the shadows of our fathers and the things they built here. But maybe if we stop expecting this place to be what it once was, and instead start building something of our own, maybe it can become, I don't know, something new, something even better. In small ways, you can already see it happening. If you think the answer is to get your family out of this town, I respect your decision, but I hope you'll reconsider because there's no other place like it. As Lou spoke, he never moved his hand from the 80-year-old playbill. He ran his thumb over his father's handwriting, then finally stepped away and looked up at Owen. What happened last night was awful, Lou said. It is awful, and I know it must feel like everything is wrong and nothing will ever be right again, and the pain will never go away. But the pain is the blessing of living. If you still feel it, it means you're still alive. Owen took those words and stored them away, intending to return to them another time. But it's not supposed to be this way, he said. How is it supposed to be then? Said Lou. I don't know. Owen breathed. Easier? Well, said Lou, it's not. It's damned hard. It's also good. Even when it's bad, it's good. Owen turned to look out the window. From somewhere on the other side of the house, he heard the soft baby noises of Emma stirring, awake with the dawn as usual. There had never been a more beautiful sound. When you think about it, said Lou, as Bandit woke up and followed the sounds of Emma out of the kitchen and through the house. Even the difficulties this family has gone through came from great victories. Your great-great-grandfather's victory was bringing his son to this country and starting a new life for him here. Your great-grandfather's victory was establishing a strong foundation and a flourishing city for his son. So much so that that son went from a dirt-poor boy from the wrong side of the tracks, literally, to the director of the city's Chamber of Commerce. Your grandfather's victory was getting our new hospital built so that when someone in our area needed emergency care, the kind of care his dad wasn't able to get the day he needed it, they could get it. There was something about the way Lou concluded that last statement that didn't feel like a conclusion at all, as if he had been planning to say more but had cut himself short. In the past, Owen wouldn't have pressed the matter, wouldn't have pried. But he'd had enough of this style of family communications, so he asked, "What's your victory, Dad?" Lou finished his coffee in one large gulp, patted Owen on the shoulder, and walked away. Chapter 40. In the days that followed, things happened that Owen expected to happen, the sort of standard logistical measures that must follow an accident. But there were also surprises, good and bad. He found himself grateful, for instance, that their home insurance policy would cover so much and take care of his family while the house was being made livable again. That said, some of the red tape he had to cut through to get to that point stunk of bureaucracy. And finding out how many of your possessions could be ruined just by soot, that was no fun either. The nice surprises were things like the care packages, which began to arrive right on the heels of the first sunrise after the fire. There were household essentials. There were clothes, towels, shampoos, and soap. But there were also things like children's books for Emma, and a baby doll, and a stuffed Curious George that was an exact duplicate of the one she wouldn't give back until it was professionally cleaned and returned to them. It became commonplace to find home-cooked meals in Tupperware containers left outside the front door with helpful reheating instructions on sticky notes. Some of Kayla's co-workers got together and gave her 5 sets of scrubs, layered atop a bottle of Moscato at the bottom of the box, and letters arrived in the mail from some of Lou's art students. Dave White and a few of Owen's other co-workers at the Herald sent him a package containing a can of dark roast coffee and a book called Archaeological Sites of the Oil Region. The card read, "To Mr. Archaeologist, with love from your Herald family." And not only was May Bauman's name on the card, but a few days after the fire, an article ran in the On This Day section of the paper from 1987 about the groundbreaking ceremony for the region's new state-of-the-art medical center, how it ushered in a bright new future for Latonia City, corn planter, and the entire county, and how Lou McCulloch had been on hand in memory of his late father, Nat, the man who had worked so hard to make this vision a reality. As for Dave Albaugh, he came to the MacCulloch home personally to visit, and to tell Owen to take as much time as he needed. Felicia from reception visited too, bringing boxes of takeout, Christmas presents, and a crayon drawing done by her oldest son, a picture of a beagle of indeterminate age wearing angel's wings. Well-wishers came like moths to a back porch lamp. Owen's in-laws, the Woodford side of the family as well as the Harts, extended multiple offers to Ruth Lee and to Owen, Kayla, and Emma to put them up in their homes until they got back on their feet. Ruth Lee took advantage of all these offers and embarked on a sort of extended family visiting excursion, staying with a whole host of loved ones over a period of several weeks. But Owen, Kayla, and Emma stayed at the MacCulloch house. Owen and Kayla were closer than they had ever been, and the only downside of living with his parents was finding enough alone time with his wife at a time in their lives when their need for alone time had never been greater. There were calls and text messages from family members and friends whom Owen hadn't spoken to in years. All of them wanted to know how they could help. It was not a fun time, those first few days after the fire, but it may have been the most loved Owen had ever felt in his life. 2 weeks after the fire, Owen was in the kitchen when he called up Dave to tell him he was ready to return to work the following week and to apologize for the inconvenience of his absence. "We'll be glad to have you back," Dave said, "but it was no inconvenience. May agreed to stay on a little longer to cover for you until you're ready." "Cover for me?" said Owen. "Sure. I hired a new girl, a smart kid right out of college, to take over the ads and most of the copy editing. I'd still like you to oversee the copy editing desk, but if you're up to it, I'd like you to take over May's position. You'll have assignments, of course, but I'd also like to see some original ideas. Maybe you could start with something from one of those history articles on your corkboard." "I could probably come up with something," Owen said. "No more 6 to midnight shifts," said Dave. "I'll see you at 10 o'clock on Monday morning." Your Mr. Archaeologist will be there," said Owen. "My Mr. Journalist," Dave corrected and hung up. "Is that something you want to do?" Lou asked Owen later over another late-night coffee in the kitchen. By now, this had become something of a tradition. Owen and Lou drinking coffee, standing in the kitchen while Bandit snored on the linoleum. "I think it's something I'd like to try," said Owen. His gaze wandered to Gideon Rust's playbill with Nat McCulloch's writing on it, which was now preserved under framed glass and hanging on the kitchen wall. "It's a shame they're going to tear down the derrick," said Owen. "I don't think it's a sure thing just yet," said Lou. "But it's prime real estate, and there's been a battle to have it torn down for years." "Huh?" said Owen, who suddenly had an idea of the kind of story he might like to write. "You ever hear about the time your grandfather saw Gid Rust at the derrick?" asked Lou. "You mean that actually happened?" said Owen. "He and his friends really snuck into the theater?" Lou made a face. "Where'd you hear that?" "Dave Albaugh's dad told me about it," said Owen. He said when he and your dad were kids, they snuck into the Derrick Theater to see Gideon Rust. Lou chuckled. Dick always was the character. Nah, this was when your grandfather was an adult. It would have been sometime in the 1960s. But look at the date on the playbill, said Owen, pointing. He wrote that when he was going to sneak in and see him that night, July 1939. Well, yeah, admitted Lou. It also says he's going to be the greatest trumpet player in the world. I'm not saying it couldn't have happened. If it did, Dad never told me about it. But come to think of it, I did hear a similar story once. It was Ruth Lee's older brother, Art Hart, who told it to me. I'd always assume it was just a tall tale. Guess I can't say one way or the other what happened in 1939, but I know he saw him play there in the 60s. And he certainly didn't sneak in. He was a member of the Latonia Arts Council at the time and helped set the show up. Huh, said Owen. So Grandpa really did see Gid Rust at the Derrick Theater. Oh, he didn't just see him, said Lou. He met him. Chapter 41. Latonia City, Pennsylvania, August 1964. Nat swallowed hard, again, against his dry throat. The woman he was following did not lead him to the door that he knew was the entry to a small office with a window and a fire escape. It was almost a shame that she didn't, because wouldn't that have been poetic? Instead, she led him a bit farther down the hall to a different room, where she stopped and knocked. For a few moments, the knock was met with no reply, and Nat thought he could smell smoke of a variety that was not usually imbibed through a traditional tobacco pipe. Then a scratchy voice from behind the door called out, "Yeah?" "It's Miss Franklin," said the woman, the third-generation owner and operator of the Derrick Theater. "I was wondering if you might have time to meet someone." "Oh, yeah," the voice said. "I hope you don't mind," said Miss Franklin. "He's a big fan of yours. He was in the front row for tonight's show." Sure, okay," said the scratchy voice. "Let him in." With that, Miss Franklin opened the door and motioned Nat to enter. Nat stepped in, and there he was. The first time Nat had seen him, he'd been overweight but not fat, tall but not towering, with hair that was thin but not entirely balding. Now he was, if anything, underweight. His back was bent, reducing his height a bit, and with the exception of a tiny bit of hair at the back of his head, his scalp was shiny and smooth. He had removed his suit jacket and sweat-soaked shirt, and he sat alone on a metal chair in his trousers and undershirt. A second chair sat directly in front of him, where his trumpet stood on end, with a white handkerchief laying beside it. Gideon Rust looked up at Nat and smiled broadly. "Hey, Mac," he said in his raspy voice. Gid called everybody Mac. "This is Nat McCulloch," said Miss Franklin. "He's a founding member of our city's Arts Council and was part of setting up tonight's show." Nat wanted to step forward and shake Gid's hand, but he worried this would be too presumptuous, so he just nodded respectfully and said, "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Story. May I call you Louis, sir?" The smile on the face of Louis Gideon Rust Story grew even broader. "You know, not many people know my real name." Miss Franklin flashed Nat a smile, then stepped out of the room to give them some privacy. "Yeah, a bit of a student of jazz history," said Nat, "and a dedicated reader of your album liner notes." "Guess you must have been reading for a long time, then," said Gid. "I don't think I've said anything about my real name, even in a liner note, since the 40s. "Oh, I've been a fan since before that, Mr. Story," said Nat. "That a fact? Well, I'll tell you what. If you paid for a front row seat, you could just as well call me Lou, okay?" At this, Nat found himself giggling like a kid. "Okay, Lou." It was then that Nat noted the small dots of blood on Gid's undershirt. He had split his lip during the encore. From what Nat understood, that happened to him quite a lot. These days, Gid Rust, who was considered one of the inventors of jazz music, was pretty old to be touring so relentlessly. In Rust's Story, The Life and Music of Gid the Great, which Nat had read twice since its publication 3 years prior, the author claimed that Gid had never really learned to hold a trumpet to his lips the right way, and as a result, frequently split his upper lip from his intense, high-register playing, sometimes requiring medical attention. The resulting buildup of scar tissue had to be frequently shaved from his upper lip by physicians to keep him in playing shape. The condition also reportedly kept him in constant pain. Up close, the scars on Gid's lips were far worse than Nat would have expected, one of which had been freshly reopened tonight. It was strange to see this once vibrant man looking so old, almost frail. A lot had changed since the days when a young Louis Gideon Story, playing a second-hand cornet in the brothels of New Orleans, first began combining ragtime and blues into a style of music that would come to be known as jazz. He was now old enough to have been confronted with one of the most tragic hardships an artist can endure, living long enough to see himself fall out of favor. With the emergence of bop, which pushed the bounds of musical complexity, jazz had evolved from dance music into a serious art form. And a byproduct of this transformation was that Gid's brand of jazz and his vibrant style of showmanship were seen as middlebrow at best. He was widely criticized by the new generation of jazz musicians, who thought of him as too accommodating to audiences, even bordering on subservient. You wouldn't have caught Miles Davis or Dizzy Gillespie goofing around on stage or pulling faces to make the crowd laugh. But in every interview Nat had ever read, Gid maintained that his persona was not about being accommodating, but about being his authentic self, with a zest for life and just putting on a good show. But Nat was only a fan. He couldn't have understood the underlying issues at play, and he couldn't claim to.
"So, what did you think of the show?"
said Gid. He made a face and touched his throat tenderly as he said it. It sounded as if it pained him to speak. Gid Rust's distinctive growl of a voice had grown increasingly gravelly over the years. A magazine article published in the late 50s claimed that this was due to nodules on Gid's vocal cords, which were actually quite problematic and threatening to his health. He'd even undergone a series of throat surgeries in an attempt to remove the nodules, but the results had been unsuccessful, leading to recurring infections that had further compromised his health and occasionally got bad enough to interrupt his touring. If it pained the man to even speak, Nat couldn't imagine what it had felt like to belt out 8 choruses of Dinah tonight. "The show was phenomenal," said Nat. "Even better than the last time I saw you."
"Oh, yeah? When did you see me last?"
"Last time you were here, sir," said Nat. 1939. That was a great show, too." Lou shook his head in wonder.
"You know, you may not believe it, but I remember that show well. I've played everywhere, man. All over the North, New York City, Chicago especially. Played in Paris, France, all the time. This was back before the war. Played more places than I can count down south, where the white folks would pay $50 a head just to see me blow my horn, but wouldn't let me use the bathroom in the same building. Did broadcasts with Frankie and Bing out west. Had a few parts in a couple of pictures. But even though I must have played 1,000 theaters all around the world, I remember this place."
"The Derrick is a wonderful theater," said Nat. "The older I get, the more I realize how lucky the city is to have this place. A beautiful waterfront venue like this right on the Allegheny."
"Nah, it wasn't the building. It was the people. Something about the crowd. That's what sticks with you. A wonderful crowd. It was the same tonight. This place has got good folks. They've treated me right."
Nat couldn't help but wonder if part of what made that 1939 show memorable for Gid was the brief disruption near the end of the night, when a few half-pint show crashers had been chased out of the projectionist room and down the second-floor fire escape. He even started to open his mouth to mention this, but instead he just said, It's such a thrill to meet you, Mr. Story. I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for me. I practically idolized you as a kid, and your music got me through some not-so-good times."
"Thank you," said Gid, smiling. "That's kind of you to say."
I stammered Nat. "I even bought a used cornet as a kid and tried to learn your version of Dinah. It drove my sisters crazy. My dream was to be a great trumpet player like you. I would make believe I was on stage with Gid the Great, right here in the Derrick." Gid lit up, laughing and smiling wider than ever.
"You still do any playing nowadays?"
A little," said Nat, although the truth was that he practiced every night without fail. "I'm an accountant by trade, so the music thing really never happened, but I still wanted to thank you." Gid nodded and stroked a dark, stubbled cheek. Then he craned his neck toward the door.
"Hey, Miss Franklin."
Nat grimaced, realizing he'd been rambling. He had overstayed his welcome. "Yes, Mr. Rust," said Miss Franklin, leaning back inside the doorway.
"Would it be a major inconvenience to turn the stage lights back on for a few minutes?"
asked Gid. "Of course not, Mr. Rust." And Miss Franklin hurried off down the hallway to make it happen. Gid stood from his chair and grabbed his trumpet. He flashed a smile at Nat and gestured toward the door.
"You feel like swinging a number or two?"
Nat felt his mouth hanging open. "I didn't bring my horn," was all he could think to say.
"That ain't no problem. You can borrow one of mine," said Gid. "What do you say?"
Nat stared. "I say, golden aces. God, yes, Mr. Story, I would love that." Gid threw his head back, laughing long and loud. He clapped Nat on the back and started for the door.
"Then come on, Mac, let's blow."
Nat was here, thought Nat MacCulloch as he followed Gid down the hallway. On the day Gideon Rust came to play at the Derrick, Nat is going to sneak into the Derrick Theater to see him tonight. Nat will someday play trumpet with Rust and will be the most famous trumpet player in the world. Nat smiled. 2 out of 3 wasn't half bad. Chapter 42, Latonia City, Pennsylvania, January 2020. The first phase of the project was done. Through a combination of electrical sanders, metal-edged scrapers, and good old-fashioned elbow grease, the old paint had been removed to reveal a blank surface beneath. It was the first week of the new year, and it was 7 o'clock on a Friday. On any other day, Owen would have been home by now. He didn't work past 6 anymore. But today was an exception. He wasn't working. He was volunteering his time. And he wasn't just a participant in this work initiative. He'd set the whole thing up himself. He had spent weeks reaching out to local businesses and individuals, asking if they would be willing to donate paint, supplies, tools, or their time to help renovate the lobby of the Oildham News Herald, whose hyphenated name, Owen had recently learned, was a holdover from the 1869 merger of Oildham Center's Oildham Daily News and the Lays Bend Herald, at the same time that the two towns on the opposite sides of the Allegheny River were incorporated into Latonia City almost 150 years prior. Who would have thought? The community response to Owen's Workday initiative had been greater than he ever could have hoped for. The Herald had received more donations than they needed, enough that Owen was certain they could have comfortably hired a team of contractors to do the work for them. But there was something special about getting the staff to take an active role in the job. Each of them had a personal stake in this lobby's transformation now and could take ownership of the results. With any luck, they would have enough funds left over to have the Keystone mosaic floor professionally cleaned. While the night staff was just beginning their shift, most of the day shift had stayed to help with the current phase of the project. The team was spread out across the lobby, with tarps laid out carefully beneath them to protect the magnificent floor. Dave Albaugh was there, and even his father Dick had made an appearance to serve as an enthusiastic delegator. Felicia had managed to find a sitter for her kids and was currently locked in conversation with Dave White, who was regaling her with the latest chronicle in the saga of Mary Ann the Ginger Cat, who, on New Year's Eve day, had brought Dave White the gift of a small mouse and dropped it on his pillowcase right beside his head while he was half asleep. Mary Ann had, however, neglected to kill it first, and Dave White was not too proud to describe how he'd nearly streaked his tidy-whities scrambling to escape from the rodent as it went scurrying beneath his bed sheets. He summed it all up by concluding, "Yeah, 2019 was a doozy of a year for everybody, I think. I'm sure 2020 will be smooth sailing." Kayla was there too, and so was Lou, and so was Owen, of course, as the organizer of the project. He had personally taken down the no-smoking sign, and he did not intend to put it back up again. Presently, he wedged the business end of a flathead screwdriver into the lid of a paint bucket, pried it open, and stuck a wooden stirrer in to begin mixing. Right about now, the new copy editor under his tutelage would be in the back offices, looking over the articles he had written, which would run the next morning. So far, none of Owen's articles had received as great a response as the very first story he'd written, a piece on the Derrick Theater and the dozens of noteworthy entertainment acts that had graced its stage over the years, including that world-famous pioneer of jazz, Gideon Rust. It had been an innocent, informative human interest story featuring a bit of local history, although he may have also included a sentence or two about the current initiative by a few wealthy citizens to have the derrick torn down, and how its destruction would mark the end of an era for Latonia City. A renewed surge of interest in the building had been spurred by Owen's article, and the Derrick Theater had even been submitted as a nominee for the National Register of Historic Places. If it was accepted, everything about the building's future would change. It occurred to Owen that he hadn't been entirely unbiased in writing that first article. A journalist was supposed to be impartial, but it would have been obvious to any reader that the writer, Owen, didn't want to see the building torn down. Did that make Owen a hypocrite? Was he no better than May Bauman, knowingly influencing his readership? Time would tell, he supposed. When the color was mixed, Owen set the stirrer to the side, poured a bit into the metal tray in front of him, and moved his roller back and forth until it was soaked. Then he climbed the small stepladder and began to apply the first coat of paint to the spot where, just a few days prior, peeling paint had hung in a row like a snakeskin. He had a funny feeling that he was being watched, and when he turned, he caught his father smiling at him. Lou looked away, but Owen wasn't fooled. Owen applied some more paint to the roller. There was work to be done. Epilogue, Latonia City, Pennsylvania, July 1988. Lou didn't get it. This kid just would not sleep. He had tried over and over again every way he could think of, but this boy just did not want to close his eyes. Lou was at his wit's end, and he couldn't rightly be mad about it because the kid wasn't even being unpleasant. Not cranky, not sad, not crying, just awake. Looking down at his son's wide, energy-filled eyes, Lou wished he was still able to feel this wide awake once in a while. But these days, he was tired. He was always tired. Why hadn't anybody told him that being a parent made you so tired? After trying every chair, couch, love seat, and bed in the house, Lou had retreated to the back porch swing where the air of a muggy midsummer's night parted around him like a damp curtain. He instantly felt sweaty and regretted the decision to come out here, even before taking a seat on the swing. But as soon as he did, he realized he'd made the right choice. The child looked up from Lou's arms, and those eyes, always so present and bright and full of life and attention, took on a different look. His eyelids drooped a little before snapping back open. "You're fighting it," he whispered to baby Owen. "I don't know why you always fight it, but you do." Owen stretched, placing one fat-fingered hand on Lou's arm. "My dad never had to rock me to sleep, you know," said Lou. "Men of his generation didn't really do that sort of thing. Your grandma was the one who did all the work while Grandpa smoked his pipe in the next room and read the paper. What a life." Lou threw a cautious glance over the back of the swing toward the house to ensure that Deb wasn't listening from the front door. "Not that I'm complaining, of course," he said. The blink of a lightning bug in Lou's peripheral vision drew his attention back toward the yard. The backyard of a small rented house just a few miles from the home he'd grown up in and where his father had grown up before him. The grass was getting tall and in need of mowing. Lou certainly hadn't expected to still be here, in this little town, at the age of 29, worrying about things like mowing the lawn. Such an apparent lack of forward momentum had the distinct whiff of failure about it, and there were times when Lou felt his spirit pulse in desperation for an escape. "Can't afford it right now," he reminded himself as another lightning bug lit up above the tall grass. "But this is only a season. A couple more years, maybe." That was what he told himself. But there were also times when the desperation diminished to such an extent that he almost forgot about it, almost misplaced it. In those moments, he felt something he couldn't quite describe. He felt almost content, like maybe this place, this life, wasn't so bad. It was easy to forget what you were supposed to want, especially on a warm, lazy summer's night with lightning bugs floating over the backyard. "I'll have to teach you to catch lightning bugs," Lou told Owen in a whisper. "Not that it's hard. You'll be a natural, probably better than me at lots of things. Heck. You'll probably be better than me at playing ball, too. Stronger, smarter. You'll get out of here and go places and do things I'll only ever dream of. And I hope you and I have a better relationship than I had with my dad. Because one of the things I regret the most is that after all the times he was patient with me when I acted like a fool, I didn't return the favor the one time he needed it. Lou had always thought of his old man as something of a supporting character in his own story, but maybe he'd had it backwards all this time. Or, more likely, the truth was somewhere in the middle. It didn't much matter either way. The real story kept moving, and it would keep on moving long after he was gone. When Lou looked down, Owen's eyes were closed. "Finally," whispered Lou. He rested his hand over Owen's. To his surprise, even in sleep, the set of tiny, fat fingers clamped down on his thumb. The grip was strong. It felt more like an innate biological reflex than a conscious decision on the boy's part, but Lou didn't mind. "I can't promise your life will be easy," Lou whispered to his sleeping son. "But there's good in it. You're proof enough of that. I've done so much wrong, spent so long trying to win, thinking I needed to hit big goals, plant a flag, announce my victory. That stuff seemed important for some reason. I don't know what happened exactly, but somehow none of it feels quite as important as it used to. Maybe all this time, all I needed was you." As the lightning bug silently winked on and off across the yard, Lou closed his eyes, thought of nothing, and fell asleep with his victory in his arms. About this book. The book you just read was written and released by an independent author. Independent authors choose to retain creative freedom and control of their work at the cost of many of the resources available to major publishing houses. If you would like to support this independent author, please consider leaving a customer review wherever books are sold, or visit patreon.com/Corey McCullough to support this author in exchange for exclusive content. Thank you for supporting independent art. About the author. Corey McCullough has worked as a ghostwriter, copy editor, proofreader, and archaeological field technician. He lives in West Pennsylvania with his wife Vanessa and their 3 children. His favorite pastimes are reading, writing, spending time with his best friend, Vanessa, and most of all, being a dad. Instagram at core.author, facebook.com/core.author, patreon.com/Corey McCullough. Books by Corey McCullough. Rust on the Allegheny, a novel. The Fallen Odyssey. The Fallen Aeneid. Shadows of the Fallen. Children of the Fallen. The Cycle of Aurum. A Knife in the Dark. A Knife in the Dark, Alloy Heart.